Sanders has been deputed. Good morning and welcome to the GIAN program of the Department of History. As you all know, the GIAN, the Global Initiative for Academic Networking, is a program sponsored by the MHRD in order to expose and help our students to come into contact with international scholarship and international levels of learning across all disciplines. We are very happy to say that this is the fourth GIAN program that the Department of History has organized. And this time, our foreign faculty, our distinguished guest, is Professor Amélia Polónia of the University of Porto, Portugal. And she will be talking on mechanisms of globalization, the Portuguese overseas expansion case study. Professor Amélia Polónia is very well known in her field. She has had a large number of publications to her credit. Her work has been on primarily three main areas. One has been networks of knowledge, the next has been networks of cooperation, and increasingly, she's looking at informal networks and networks of trust. In these areas, she has contributed significantly with her core area on the study of the Portuguese expansion, and as in Europe, this is called the early modern world. It is not a term that we in India use, but in the early modern world and the ways in which Portuguese entered, shaped, and others reacted to the presence of the Portuguese first and the Europeans later in this early modern world. A very brief CV of Professor Amélia Polónia. She is a professor of Portuguese overseas expansion and history of European colonization at the FLUP. That's the Faculty of Literature at the Faculty of Letters at the University of Porto. She is with the CITSEM, that is the Transdisciplinary Research Center for Culture Space Memory. She is the Vice President of the IMEHA, the International Maritime Economic History Association. Since 2015, has been a panel member of the Agency for Assessment and Accreditation of Higher Education Portugal, as well as an external member of the Scientific Board of the CNRS France, an advisory member, board member of the ERC Starting Grant, and also scientific coordinator of the research network, Governance of Atlantic Seaports, 14th to the 20th Centuries. Her most recent book, published in 2016, has been an edited book on seaports in the First Global Age, which was been published by the University of Porto Press. There is another one that has come out since then. Yes. But as you can see, there is a great deal that one has to learn from Professor Amélia Polónia. I welcome Professor Polónia, and I will hand it over to.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for your presence, mostly in the Sunday. It is a great pleasure for me being here and participating in these programs of exchange and mobility. I have to thank the Department of History of Pune University, most particularly to Professor Radhika Sesham, which you know for a while. I have the privilege to cooperate scientifically with some colleagues from India, one of which is certainly Professor Radhika Sesham, with whom we have some common publications. What means that dialogue between different historiographical schools and tendencies is not only possible, but this is the right way to think and keep rethinking history. So it is really for me a great opportunity and a great pleasure to be here to discuss with you the few knowledge I do have about the topic we are going to talk about, because obviously speaking about globalization is quite a challenge. And it's quite a challenge because nowadays we do have so many senses, so many significance of the concept of globalization. And I'm going to talk it about what we usually call, as Professor Radica said, the first global age between 16th, 18th century. On the opposite, when we speak about globalization nowadays, we think about the internet, we think about social networks, we think about digital cultures all over. And when we speak about the second globalization, we think about economy, we think about international business companies, we think. So this topic I'm going to bring here has not to do with this most economic or obviously not even digital universe, but has to do about ways of connecting worlds precisely through a process, conflictive and cooperative, that arises connected with, but not exclusively motivated by, the European overseas expansion. So the topic is, I think, challenge enough to be discussed precisely between worlds and between different historiographical tendencies, schools and opinions. That's why it is for me, again, a privilege and opportunity to be able to share with you what I've been producing and thinking of, and focusing on the Portuguese case study, which I think is pertinent since obviously the Portuguese colonization in the East and Far East is clearly a central topic of the Portuguese, the European, but also of the Indian historiography. These kind of programs, the mobility and exchange, and we do have also one at the University of Porto, which is called Mobile Plus, of which the University of Pune is also a partner. And it means that also the students can go for a semester in Porto, or students from Porto can come for a semester in Pune. It is also the essence, the basis of cooperation between our universities, which is mainly the topic of this participation. So today I'm just going to briefly present which are the aims of the course, and then beginning with the revision of the historiographical perspectives, the Portuguese historiographical perspectives of the Portuguese overseas expansion. This is a kind of self-representation of what is this phenomena. As for, so we have here two keywords, globalization and mechanisms of globalization. So for me, as historian, what I prefer to try to understand is not what happens, but how that it happened. So the mechanisms of whatever dynamics we are studying are extremely important on that. And what we want is really to characterize and discuss the concept of globalizations. As I said, there are different concepts to different time periods. And to present some of the more recent historiographical perspective on the Portuguese overseas expansion, characterize the geographical and colonial expansion of the Portuguese in the period known as the First Global Age, on the scope of the overall process of the Portuguese overseas expansion. We do know it is contentious, it is not unanimous to call this period the First Global Age, or even considering the Portuguese the main lever of this period. But we are going to talk about it. Then we want to take into account both formal strategies and informal and self-organized mechanisms of globalization. And if I may, I'm going to just to underline this idea because this is the main message I want to pass through is really globalization in the period I'm talking about. It happened not only or not mostly because of the intervention of the states, of the formal powers, because among them there is conflict, there is war, there is rivalry, there is all kinds of frontiers, of borders that are established, and those are somehow against globalization. So what I prefer to talk is the other side of this coin. What I prefer to focus is on the individuals and on the informal ways by which individuals of different cultures, different religions, different trading systems interact with them, a kind of elapsing borders between universes, and that certainly contributes to creation of a global world in economic, in cultural, in linguistic terms. So the focus will be more in informal and self-organized mechanisms of globalization. And obviously, I would like to discuss with you all concepts and dynamics of cooperation, self-organization, cross-cultural, and trans-imperial dynamics. By now, in Europe and also in the United States, those are really key concepts of new historiographical trends that seems to be important. So the aim of the course is to focusing in the Portuguese overseas expansion, going through these problems and these issues. The program, you know it. I'm not going to repeat it because it is available, I guess, in all your dossiers. So what we would like, this is a course, this is a university course, so it has to be some learning outcomes of it. So what you want is to get some a comprehension of the historical dynamics of the Portuguese overseas expansion from the Portuguese point of view. We all try not to be Eurocentric, but the fact is that, as I see it, the best contribute I can give to you is to bring to you the tendencies of the Portuguese historiographical trends about it. Except I'm totally open to receive the contributions, and that's why nowadays the publishing international market allows us to share contributions and perspectives for different historiographical tendencies and origins. But obviously, I'm trying to discuss and explain to you our main question still today in Portugal. How come a very small country like Portuguese just went out of its own limits and was really able to establish some contact points all over the world? So to go a little bit on this comprehension of the historical dynamics of the Portuguese overseas expansion, develop critical capacities toward the historical understanding of colonial processes in the first global age, as I said, not focusing in central powers, but focusing on individuals, on networks, and some of them informal, not recognized, or even illegal networks, and understanding the interference of issues of alterity and multiculturality to go beyond the formal strategies of imperial dominion and rivalries. Doing so, we are not denying that strength and forceful mechanisms and violence and dominion existed. We all know they are inherent in any process of colonialism. We are just trying to go beyond that and try to understand how alterity, the understanding of the other, and multiculturality was processed in these dynamics. And, as I said before, introduce those concepts of cooperation, self-organization, and informal ways of empire building. Okay, this bibliography you will have also in your dossier, and this course implies some kind of evaluation for those who are enrolled in it. So my proposal is that we do that with very short presentations of the students, and those short presentations can go alternatively being a kind of a perspective or a review of one paper which will be delivered to you, and it was already, I guess, some material on Michael Pearson perspective of the Indian Ocean was already delivered. The other ones will be there. So a review of one paper, or just a kind of a reflection, personal reflection, a case study in which you might apply the concept of glocality. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. And or the concept or the idea of self-organization or cooperation as a mechanism of globalization. What I see in terms of teaching and in terms of interfering and communicating, namely with the students, is that we learn much more when we just can apply an example, which is very concrete, which is near of our experience. So it could be some kind of a reflection of a case, of specific circumstances in which that concept would be useful for me, or would explain what we wanted to. We can clarify a little bit more that in the. Okay, that's okay. In the next classes. So we are going to leave it, and now. We are going to, sorry, it's not this one. Let me see. So we are going now to enter a little bit in perspectives, historiographical perspectives on the Portuguese overseas expansion. To understand how we tend to go from a national and a nationalist point of view to a perspective which is itself global and which is based on cooperation perspectives. So the aims of this part is to present an appraisal of the evolving historiographical path of the Portuguese overseas expansion and present some recent historiographical perspectives on Portuguese overseas expansion. So as I was saying, there is a basic question for centuries that are taking the attentions of historians in Portugal and Europe and all over the world. How were the Portuguese the kind of pioneers or the first in this kind of maritime global expansion? And when I say so, I'm not denying or forgetting the global connection in the Indian Ocean or in the North Sea or in the Mediterranean, because those were all maritime spaces in which people and cultures and economy were in contact. I'm not pretending to stress the idea that the Portuguese were the first beginning a process of decompartmentalization of the world or of globalization, because it happened already, and it happened not only by land. For instance, the trade caravans of North Africa or the silk traffic on the east. Those are obviously connecting ways of different economies and parts of the world. But I think it is a fact that the Portuguese were in fact the first to create these global connections, to really use oceans to put in contact all continents. I'm not denying that it was a very active dynamics already settled in the Indian Ocean, as it was in Mediterranean, as it was in North Sea, but the founding, the discovery from the Europeans or to the Europeans of new continent created really global networks. And why were the Portuguese the first to do that? This is really, and how could they do it? I mean, it was a very small country. There was less than, when it begins, Portugal was really located on the western margin of Europe. it had a very fragile demographic expression around 1 million inhabitants in the second half of the 15th century. It is a very small territory, as you can see, and it is really located in the extreme west of Europe. So it was really peripheral to Europe. It was really marginal towards the main centers of knowledge, for instance, or of the main political centers, or of the main economic centers of Europe. So, in fact, Portugal was small, and it was on the margins of all that systems. And it is very interesting because I think it is something to think about it. Frequently, the margins became centers. The marginality becomes centrality in lots of historical process, and I think it was exactly what happened with Portugal. But so the question remains: how was it possible, and how was it possible, thinking that Portugal was not extremely developed, both economic and demographically? This is the expression of a census, of a demographic census of 1527-32, in which we can obviously see the major expression of Lisbon in demographic terms, and then Porto on the north, the second urban center, and then you can see Évora and some other in Alentejo and the Algarve coastal areas. So those are the main centers, the demographic centers of Portugal, but the population was really a very small population. What brings us to think the motivations of, because usually when you think of colonization or migration or expansion, people think that it is a demographic pressure, for instance, that lets people away. It is not the case of Portugal. Sometimes, and it happened, for instance, when we think about Great Britain or so, you are looking for new markets for your own products. But for that, you have to have a very active industry. So you need new markets for it. It's not the case of Portugal. So you might need really raw material to implement your needs but it's not the case of Portugal. Okay? So it remains debatable what took Portugal to this geographical expansion, which was, in my view, much more accidental than intentional. It was not a planned thing. It was just an empirical way of getting away and solve some of the internal problems of Portugal. So to this question, there has been multiple interpretations and answers. Most of them are pretty much nationalists, and obviously there are already interpretations of the past. Even so, I'm going to remind them how the Portuguese historiography explained themselves the Portuguese overseas expansion. What you know about this is that it began in 15th century. It was based on maritime dynamics. In all these, oceans are a central topic. It put in place regular maritime runs. This is very important, the question of the logistics, the question of regularity of contacts, because it is quite proven that the Vikings were already in Canada, in Newfoundland, much previously to the French or the British, but they didn't establish regular contacts. So this kind of globalization process we're talking about imply really the regularity and the periodicity of those contacts. And the Portuguese established that by sea, establishing all these regular maritime runs. The Africa run, the Cape run, the Brazil and the Newfoundland run. And they, in fact, opened a European trend of overseas colonial settlements and colonization processes. They contributed to a different concept of the world. We're going to see it cartographically. They contributed to the building of a first global age. This is a interrogation, a remark point, because it is debatable, and they started dynamics of confrontation as well as of transference of cultural patterns in a large worldwide scale. And this is another important thing. Professor Radikers said that I'm concerned about networks of transference of knowledge. Because really, in my view, even more important than the economic transferences are really the human transferences, but also the transference of knowledge, the transference of plants, the transference of diseases, the transference of all kinds of small things or big things that really made the world global. It was because, for instance, the Portuguese began to understand the medical knowledge of the East and Far East, that there is this transformation of Europe as well. So this is not an univocal process of domination. It is a reciprocal process of contacts, and from contacts come different ways of dealing with reality. So these global processes, they really transform the world that becomes clearly more global, not only geographically. Obviously, this is a traditional approach to this topic. Those are former representations from the 9th century, from the 12th century, from the 15th century, how Europe, not only Europe, because some of those maps are Arabian maps, but how the world would see the world. So, and in that point, I think we can agree that the navigations performed not only by the Portuguese, but first by the Portuguese, were able to begin really to define the contours of the coastal lines and the dimension of the oceans, and mostly the idea that oceans connect, because in all these representations, oceans do not connect. What seems to be dominant is the land surface of it, and oceans, they are just some kinds of lakes that confined. And on the opposite, what you see by the experience of this maritime expansion at the global level is that really oceans connect. And I am a maritime historian, and this is for me a very important topic that seems to happen in mostly in the first global age, from 15th to the 18th century, even if I go again and I underline this idea that's clear that the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean or the Northern Sea were in themselves space of connections of people and materials. So which are the classic interpretations of the Portuguese overseas expansion? In the 19th century was dominated by, in Europe, what you called the Romantism or the Romanticism. So there is psychological interpretation of the phenomenon, even of the political phenomenon. And so some Portuguese authors would speak about an indomitable spirit of the Portuguese. They were unable to be confined to the small expression of their country, so they needed really to adventure. This is obviously a kind of psychological, we cannot prove it by historical sources, as you can imagine, because it's just a very creative way of justifying some dynamics. Some insisted in a religious analysis and trying to say that this was the European, clearly the Portuguese reaction in times of the Muslim invasion of Europe or penetration of Europe, taken 1453, the taking of Constantinople by the Turks as the main focus. But let's face it. The world of the Portuguese, when we really know the history of Portugal, contradicts all this. Because we are talking in times in which the news didn't circulate as fast as today, as you can imagine, and in which people, they were confined to their own village, small village, because Portugal had a religious organization of the space rather than administrative, to that parochial world. So this idea that the Portuguese were reacting to European expectations to perform as a reaction of the loss of Constantinople, so forth, it is not understandable in this context. They are a kind of anachronic explanations for this phenomenon. Plus, in 1453, the Portuguese were already well settled in Africa. All began in the beginning of the 15th century. So this religious fact is an explanation, it's not a motivation. Because obviously in Europe, who would legitimate the plans for expansion and war and whatever was the Pope. So it would be paramount that the political leaders would go to this religious explanation to get legitimacy or to get legitimation to their possessions, to their wars, to their colonial experiences. So if we read the documents, obviously the religious arguments are there. They have to be. They are rhetorical legitimation arguments. What we historians have to go is beyond that, beyond this kind of explanations. What should be the reasons? Some just focus on the strength of some Portuguese leaders, and then we talk about Henry the Navigator, which you certainly heard already. Okay, Henry was a prince, but he was certainly not a navigator. He was much more a warrior in a medieval sense of the word. He never really navigated except crossing the Mediterranean to go and participate in wars in Ceuta or Tangier. So it was a construct. This Henry the Navigator was clearly a construction of the what you called the Salazar regime. I'm getting back to it again, but the Portuguese overseas expansion was built, historiographical interpretations were built by contamination of political programs and political intents. And there is several moments in which that it happened. First of all, the first, it's not the first, but it is the most evident moment in which the Portuguese overseas expansion is explained as a major phenomenon of the Portuguese, as a kind of heroic ways of putting themselves in the world, was during the First Republic, 1910-1926, because they were clearly reacting to the division of the world between the different European powers. And obviously the traditional settlements of the Portuguese in Africa, in the East namely, were clearly being challenged, mostly by the British, but also by the French and the German and so forth. So the history was the only argument that the politicians have. The history, it was the historical rights. The Portuguese were the first. And that kind of argument was vital to the position. It was not determinant, as we could see by the events, because obviously Europeans decided to share the world amongst themselves, but it was not certainly based in historical rights. But there was, in a great extent, the rights that the Portuguese could claim, because they could not claim that they really dominated those territories. They could not claim they were really exploiting economically those territories. But they could claim their historical rights to it. So the history became a tool for the political intents, and that contaminated a lot the historiographical discourse on the Portuguese overseas expansion. And it got even more visible during the Salazar regime. As you certainly know, Salazar was a dictator, and it was a dictatorship that was established in Portugal mostly between 1933 and 1974, period in which a revolution, very Pacific revolution, began introduced the democratic regime in Portugal, which is now still ongoing. So the Salazar regime used the Portuguese overseas expansion history as a means of consolidating its regime, and more than that, to justify the still ongoing colonization of Africa. Because in a period in which all over Europe, the decolonization process, not in Europe by European powers, the decolonization process was ongoing, the Portuguese refused to leave the positions in Africa. So they tried to get some theoretical arguments, theoretical reasons in order to explain why they should remain as colonizers when all the European trend was decolonizing. So the Salazar regime used that theories, and then there was this time that in which racist theories and eugenic ways of explaining reality were increasing. And I cannot spend lots of time with this, but in terms of what I'm trying to explain you, this concept of Luso-tropicalism is very important. I don't know if you are aware of this, so I would explain a little bit more. So Gilberto Freire was a Brazilian anthropologist and sociologist. He was a very well-known theoretical, and he was recognized by the United Nations, by UNESCO, and so forth. So as an anthropologist, he was trying to understand the multi-racism, the multiculturalism of Brazil. And he became with this concept of Luso-tropicalism. So this idea was that Portuguese were different. And the Portuguese, where they were all over the world, they would adapt. They would intermingle. They would interact much more than other Europeans with local populations. And he was observing this in Brazil. And he has a huge amount of publications in which he presents this as a singularity of the Portuguese interaction with local populations, stressing the idea that they intermingled much more and created this kind of Luso-tropicalism. Okay, I have to say that this is a kind of my opinion as well, in the sense that it was not because they are different, it is because they need that kind of intermingle. That's because Portuguese didn't have the means, didn't have the military means, didn't have the administrative means, didn't have the economic means, because they were, that's why I began where I began, a very small part of Europe. They were not strong in Europe. They didn't have armies. They didn't have a navy. They didn't have... So they were based mostly in the strength of the individual dynamism and initiative in the overall process, as I'm going to try to stress along these classes. So even if I do agree with the result, the fact is that this was used by the Salazar regime to justify the presence in Africa. Even if Gilberto Freire were talking about this, about the 16th, the 17th, the 18th century, the Salazar regime drove the explanations from a more racist point of view, or for and the idea that the Portuguese they had the mission to civilize the world, say turn down that argument to focus on this, because this was scientifically comproved. And the authority of Gilberto Freire as a sociologist was in favor of the argument. So it became a strength for a dictatorial regime. And it influences still today the historiographical explanations, because when today we speak about cooperation, people always go and think, oh, this is Lusotropicalism. This is the speech of the dictatorship. And that's the problem of history, is that really, politically, it tends to be used by political senses, and then historians have to be very rigorous in their methods, in their criticism, in their theoretical point of view, in order to present their own theories. So this idea of the Portuguese vocation to melt with tropical people and its civilizational role was part of the propaganda of the Salazar regime, and it clearly was not accepted for decades and decades, because what prevailed was the perspective of what existed, obviously. It was rivalries between European powers, and it was also the forceful mechanisms of the Europeans over other parts of the world. But in my view, this is what creates Eurocentrism, is the idea that the European made it all. That even when there is some kind of evaluation, negative evaluation of that intervention of the Europeans, which obviously is consensual nowadays, the fact is that the idea is that the European made it all by their own. And it is not possible. It would not be in any way possible, because there is quite a few number of contributions, or a significant number of contributions from other cultures, other religions, other people, So anyway, this idea of Lusotropicalism would explain why the case of the Portuguese colonization were different, but it was contaminated by these political uses by the Salazar regime. And so all the ideological perception of it was produced and reproduced, namely through the monuments that are visible, in which you can see obviously the idea that the Henry the Navigator was the bulwark of all this, and you can see some kind of a movement which is made by clergymen, by noblemen, by military men, and so the people is totally forgotten in these dynamics. And then you have this kind of iconic way of explaining it all in the beginning, in the 15th century, as being projected, as being portrayed by Henry the Navigator. And again, this is clearly historiographical construction that is totally outdated. Even today, people still talk about the Sagres School, and it is represented. This is just an advertising for holidays in Algarve, so to catch tourists' attention, and they go and get the idea of the Sagres School. And according to the traditional historiography, the Sagres School was the place where Henry the Navigator put the best experts all over to teach the Portuguese navigators how to. It never existed as such. And, I mean, it took decades to accept this. And sometimes I go abroad and people still speaking about the Sagres School if it was a reality. It was clearly a creation, an invention, and obviously nowadays, but even so in the 1940s, there were authors, one particular author, Luciano Pereira da Silva, Cordeiro da Silva said that the school of Sagres were in fact the experience of the caravels. What it means is that it was an empirical building of knowledge. And there we go again to the individuals, there we go again to the common people, there we go again to the empirical ways of doing things, which are as much operative as the institutional way. So there was this creations, this mythification of reality, and that was obviously an ideological perspective of all this, as we can see in the major realizations in Lisbon 1940s, and then the celebration of the death of the infant Henry the Navigator in 1960. So the idea of the Portuguese expansion and all the symbols, the sphere and the geographical references of it, side by side with the building of nationality, they were the main symbols of a regime. So those are typically the strands of the national interpretation of the strength of the Portuguese of pioneering over the world, because they were required politically in order to a more sustainable relations of Portugal among the other partners in Europe. Nowadays, it was important because after 1974, there was a time in which we almost didn't produce immediately the history of the Portuguese overseas expansion. Because obviously by that time, the concept of colonialism was emerged. So a much more critical position was to be put forward, and a new understanding of this reality had to be also put forward. And it was also the time in which decolonization in Africa produced civil wars. First it was the colonial war, and then it was civil wars in Angola, in Mozambique, in Guinea. So they were very conflictive periods and that sustained the historiographical revision of all this process because, again, ideological reasons in an opposite sense. The fact is that now there is other approaches to this reality, and these other approaches, they led us a little bit away of this idea of the central power projects to dominate the world, which never existed as such, and to focus differently, and to focus in local dynamics, and to go through methodology of the microhistory, as focusing on the people as actors of these dynamics, and to understand how come was it possible, and speaking about the means, the logistics, the technical means, the human resources. How was it possible that this small country were able, in fact, to put in order this global expansion? It means that we have new questions, new approaches, new sources of information, but also new perspectives and new interpretations. When I say new sources of information, is that it is clear for any historian that if you use central archives, you are using the perspective of central power. It is obvious the documents were produced by the government, by the state representatives, and so you have the perspective of a kind of a project of power and the tools of that power and authority. If you go to those small seaports, small municipalities, and you use the local sources, if you use the sources produced by the municipality, the notary records, the parish records, the confraternity records, you have a totally different perspective of the reality. Obviously, we are aware that they are both real. They might be conflictive, they might be complementary, but they are not certainly the same. So if you go to a different approach, you go to get new sources, you get new perspectives of those sources, and you get, obviously, new interpretations of the phenomena. And in terms of Portugal, what you have here is that map that we saw before. This is the main demographic centers of Portugal. They are not many and they are not very expressive in 16th century, I mean. But those are the distribution of the maritime population, the concentration of maritime population throughout all the Portuguese coastline. And we can, by comparison, understand very, very quickly that Lisbon might have been the capital of the empire, but what made it possible was not centralized in Lisbon. What made it logistically, technically, and humanly possible was not really in Lisbon, was distributed all over the country. So Algarve mostly, and then this is the north region with Porto as the main one, and in terms of seaports, besides Lisbon, as we can see, we have a lot of satellite ports that make it possible. Why is it possible? We were talking about mechanisms of globalization. It is important because who made that globalization were not the king in his wisdom and in his politics, was the real people, was the common people, was the agents in the field. And those agents in the field were not all of them, or not mostly, recruited by the Portuguese crown. They had their own agenda, and they had their own methodology and mechanisms, and they were not always controlled by the crown. That's why we can have different perspectives of globalization mechanisms. And that's why we have to focus also in the common people as actors. Obviously, all this combines with macro approaches. So what we are seeing is that I've been doing that for more than 20 years as an historian, is to go from the micro approach, is to go from small universes and try to understand how did it happen, what led those common people to go to a trip. They were not all navigators. Let's underline this idea. What motivated them, and then what did they bring back? I mean, how did they represent those worlds they were contacting with? Because the representations, the understanding or non-understanding those different worlds is essential to understand the connecting points, the dialogue or the conflictive points, the interests or so. So obviously with this micro approach, we have to combine with the new tendencies of history, the global history, the world history, the Atlantic history, and obviously today more and more these tendencies of analyzing all these factors through the length of a cross-cultural and trans-imperial history. While here the cross-cultural frequently connects different worlds, the worlds of the colonized and the worlds of the colonizers. Here we try to understand, and we have to, how the empires themselves have to cooperate among them, frequently to achieve their goals. That was not only rivalry that engaged them, it was also cooperation. If we go again to this concept of globalization, in terms of logistics, it is obvious that it was a condition for this European expansion to happen. Well, I was thinking and I was talking about the logistics of that expansion. Okay, the logistics, it implied a flow of men, information, knowledge, and capital. And those men, information, knowledge, and capital, they were certainly not even mainly European. So the European really depended on this transference and improvement of models. And in terms of the agents involved, it is quite clear in terms of all over the international historiography that obviously in the case of the Portuguese we are focusing, they were obviously dependent on local pilots, for instance, in the East or in Far East. They were dependent on local crews. They were dependent even on recruitment of soldiers to the Portuguese armies. So, and the opposite is true also. I mean, the nautical knowledge of the European were introduced in the different world, the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and so these kind of transferences, they were absolutely inevitable, but the dependency of the European from this local knowledge is paramount, obviously. And then this is as in my view, the most important part of it, the information flow. And in this information flow, there are agents that we frequently forget. If we have the time in the last class, we are going to talk about women as agents of this globalization, of this cross-cultural. And in this flow of information, women were real essential links. Obviously, the technical information was important, but women were present in the ships as well. So we are going to discover, in the historiographical terms, I mean, different agents and different ways, because we have to study not only the confrontation point, but the flows, the way people transform, and the world is transformed by these different. And it happened, obviously, even before the Portuguese began their expansion. I mean, the technical means they have, they come from the Arabs, they come from Italians, they come from the Spanish, they come from the North Europe. So this is obviously the sharing of knowledge that makes it possible to create a global pattern of, in this case, geographical and nautical discoveries. So, in terms of knowledge, we always have to cross national and cultural and national borders in order to understand. And obviously, in terms of capital, there is no ways for us to understand the colonization process, the expansion process, without understanding that the capital was international capital, and it was based on multi-religious, financial, and trade networks. So in Europe, Catholics, Protestants, Jewish, New Christians, which could or not remain as being Jewish, they were paramount, as much as, for instance, the networks between the new Portuguese New Christians or Jews and the Armenians articulated those two different empires. This is another criticism that I think is due to European historiography. We always talk about the European empires, and we just forget that other huge empires were built, of which the Ottoman Empire was not obviously one to forget. And so these connections between empires is absolutely essential to understand the achievement of this building of different worlds. So a new historiographical paradigm arises from these new tendencies. So transnational approaches and the role of cooperation. And here there was a project running until 2011. It was between 2008 and 2011, which was founded by the European Science Foundation Program, the evolution of cooperation and trade. So there was a team in which I was a member, was responsible for the Portuguese team, and it was based on what we called agent-based network analysis. So we tried to understand the mechanisms of trade and the mechanisms of cooperation, which was the subject of the global call for projects, based on trade, on the early modern expansion and colonization process, and having as methodology also the network analysis. So this project began by these very simple, we would say, assumptions that I think they can be easily taken as consensual. And the first idea is that between the 15th and the 18th century, the world economy was characterized by widespread collaboration across the boundary of countries and continents. This collaboration was made possible by new means of global communication and the building of formal but also informal networks, frequently multinational. This idea that this cooperation was based on self-organizing networks, characterized by the diffusion of authority. I'm going to stop a little bit here. This self-organization concept is very important. So it makes us to revise the idea that everything happened according to a plan, that it was a central plan put in place by the Portuguese or the British or the Dutch. The other idea that take us to a different approach to this reality is lots of what happened was self-organized. It means it was not intended, was not projected, was not conceived by a central power, but it was just put in place by the entrepreneurship and the initiative of individual agents that organized, obviously, themselves, but they would self-organized. And there was not an imposed authority, but there was mechanisms which are very complex, are sometimes fuzzy to understand, but they had their own rules. So this concept of self-organization is very important as well. And obviously this central idea, and I'm still speaking about this DynCoopNet project, Dynamic Cooperation in Trade Networks in First Global Age. So this project assumed all this and assumed that networks frequently bypassed the segmental political hierarchies characterized of the period's government. So based on this theoretical approach, DynCoopNet was departing from the assumption that the world economy became, in this first global age, and I explained already why we call it the first global age, even if it is not consensual. During this period, the world economy became a dynamic, open, complex, non-linear system. And cooperation tied together several self-organizing networks. And the history of any place could not be understood without examining how it was connected to the system as a whole. And here we're talking about globalization. We cannot understand the prices of the spices in Amsterdam without understanding what is happening in the overall Atlantic, for instance, the piracy or the privateering, and we cannot understand any of that without understanding with what is happening in terms of market suppliers in the East or the Far East. So it really became global because you cannot understand any place without putting it in a global framework of connection it has all over the world. And obviously we have to understand that variations among subsystems constitute an aspect of the system complexity as a whole. It doesn't mean that all is the same. It means that there are subsystems that have to interact among them. And for them to interact among them, we have to go and talk about mechanisms of cooperation. And mechanisms of cooperation are there then essential to understand how you can connect these different subsystems and these specific and so different worlds among themselves. So with this proposal, what we tried was in fact going from the parochial to the global, even if, and again, departing from local studies. In a moment ago, I put in the screen the concept of glocality. I don't know if you are familiar with that concept. You certainly are. But anyway, you have two concepts, the global and the local. And this idea that you cannot separate them. Because you might have global phenomenon, but frequently you cannot study those global phenomena rather than a local sphere and the local universe. So you have the contacts of the global with the local and vice versa. And frequently when you use the methods of the microhistory, for me microhistory is very simple. It's just to put, just in a lab, put reality into the length of a microscope. So we really have a small sample, but we can learn about that small sample much more than we can if we don't use the length of the microscope. So frequently those implications or the consequences of the globalization cannot be understood rather than if we go to the local and to the micro, and try to analyze both the levers of globalization and the consequences and the globalization. Even so, what you wanted was to go from parochial to global, from boundaries analysis to cross boundaries, from state and institution to individuals, and from formal to informal patterns, from rivalry and antagonism to cooperation. And by the time we began all this process was in 2007, it was really not aspects treated by the historiography. So, it is clear that the role of the Central Power in the construction of European empires was undeniable. It was clear that the complex system produced and coordinated by the Central Power depended on cooperation of individuals. So states have to catch the attention and the attention of the individuals. It is clear that the role of self-organizing networks working in favor or even against state policies and system is central to the understanding of informal ways of building colonial settlements, as it is essential to understand how these different networks and informal networks from different worlds are essential to understand the mechanisms of globalization. And then global interactions based on self-organizing networks produced some dynamics that crossed political, religious, and economic frontiers. So cross frontiers is essential. We can give a huge amount of examples. We don't have the time to do that. But for instance, we cannot but think about national, international, but intercontinental trade networks. Let's think, for instance, about the slave trade of Africa. And as we know, and nowadays also in India, there is a huge, significant production, historiographical production about the slave trade, which is extremely important for me, for us that don't really have access to the sources and to understanding of all these mechanisms. So in terms of the European historiography, which is more dealt with, is the African slave trade. So the African slave trade, or whatever, slave trade in general, it asked for intercontinental trade networks, in which Portuguese, African traders and Brazilian ones were, in the case of the Atlantic slave trade, extremely important. And it was important because it involved not only Portuguese, but Portuguese, Dutch, and the British and French, and obviously the Spanish. The Spanish depended first on the Portuguese, then on the British to feed their empires with slaves. So we cannot just think this empire building process from a national point of view, because the trans-imperial was also extremely important. So interconfessional networks, for instance, the trade of diamonds. There are at least 2 PhD theses about that prove how the diamond trade networks were interconfessional. They had to be. So there is this worldwide transference of goods and capital and the communication systems that imply the value of trust and reputation. And even the gossip. The gossip is central mechanism of advertising and warning. And so the trust and reputation, we'll talk about this later, because this is the most challenging thing, I think, for us. This is very well studied in terms of Europe. Trust and reputation between merchants, trust and reputation between different companies, trust and reputation between the different agents of the same company. Very well. But trust and reputation implies understanding of different codes of values, of behavior. And when, for instance, we are talking about China, Japan, when we're talking about India, or when we're talking about Morocco or Europe, the cultural codes, they are not the same. So the cultural dialogues, they are not the same. This is real, I think, what we have to work more and more, how this communication happened and how this how to build trust and reputation among systems, cultural, ethical systems that were different from each other. This is, I think, a challenge. And then, obviously, when we speak about this cooperation, we are not talking about positive cooperation in the sense that it was a paradise in which everybody would cooperate voluntary with everybody. On the opposite. First of all, part of this cooperation was forced cooperation. That was enforced by the ones that dominated by military or economic means. Sometimes it was not really collaboration, because cooperation is not synonymous of collaboration. So collaboration would be the last level, the higher level of all these processes. It could be just coordination of movements. Coordination in the sense that, for instance, you have a kind of a fleet that goes together, and there is a Portuguese boat that goes among a Chinese fleet, for instance. This is coordination of movements towards a same objective. It can be just communication. But, and this is what I wanted to stress, and it is very interesting indeed, studying the mechanisms of cooperation, you have to understand the negative cooperation. Frequently, when someone seems to be cooperating with the other, but in fact he is cheating the other, but in fact he is creating competition or establishing mechanisms of defection. This applies between international and interconfessional networks, but it applies as well, for instance, in the relationship of the small traders with state, the small maritime Portuguese traders with the Portuguese crown. And it is more than studied by so many historians, not to say the least, Michael Pearson or Subramanian, that how you have sometimes different universities. One is the representatives of the state of the India, and the other one is those informal, clandestine, illegal networks of trade that the Portuguese established. Illegal, illegitimate on the eyes of the Portuguese crown, on the eyes of the state of India. So you have this kind of mechanism, defection, cheating, and competition, even between the European agents and the European powers. And please do interrupt me if you are not following my reasoning on this. Any doubts about this proposal? Because this model of understanding doesn't even come from history. History is a kind of trying to apply this. It became first from economy, then it was biology that clearly put forward this study of mechanisms of cooperation, and then anthropology, sociology, psychology, and nowadays the history are using the theoretical framework and the concepts and the methodologies to study cooperation in order to understand phenomenon that we didn't understand before or we didn't question before. So, theoretical and methodological framework is based on theories of cooperation and self-organization. A focus on micro rather than the macro analysis. A scrutiny focusing on the people as actors and not only on the structures and the systems. And what we proposed is an agent-based approach centered on the operations of individuals and groups of individuals. Okay, theories of cooperation. It is quite simple. The concept is simple. A cooperation is a behavior which should provide a benefit to another individual and which is selected because of its beneficial effect on the recipient. Theoretically, cooperation should be beneficial for both parts involved. So cooperation is a collective action of individuals who aim to share a certain task, lucrative for all participants. If we study the networks of Armenian and Portuguese new Christians, we totally understand that. They are quite different from cultural, religion, or whatever point of view, but they aim to share a certain task which should be lucrative for all participants. Cooperation is a social process where individuals, groups, and institutions act in a concerted way to reach common goals. And it is a behavior driven by goals, expectations, and motivations, which imply a collective or dyadic interaction between individuals. Those concepts bring us, obviously, to a different methodological approach, which comes with this idea that we can have spontaneous cooperation or forceful cooperation. First of all, empires might force local population to cooperate in a certain extent with them. And secondly, people might be involved in these mechanisms of cooperation, but doing this in their own profit with these red ways of participating in this game. And I tell it is a game because mathematicians study this according to the game theory. If you identify which are the agents, which are the variables, so you can go through game theory to study all this. This is very complex, but it is feasible. Okay, cooperation. No doubts about what implies and which is the concept and the idea. Self-organization. Self-organization is a theory that is as well very well explained, and usually I go to Modelsky, which is a political scientist, but it is quite clear about his understanding of that. So a self-organization is a process where some form, order, or coordination arises out of the interactions between the components of an initially disordered system. It goes with the perspective of focusing on the individuals and focusing on this fuzzy world, which is not ruled by a very clear political and central understanding, in which is extremely, it seems to be disordered. It seems to be chaotic sometimes. It seems to be fuzzy, but an order arises from that. And then it is spontaneous. Self-organization is not directed or controlled by any agents or subsystem inside or outside the system. And the principles of self-organizations are really connected with world systems functioning. So, basically, while we are used to those hierarchical ways of world systems in which you think about centers, semi-peripheries, or peripheries, and obviously the center is Europe, is Lisbon, is London, or is Amsterdam, or is Seville, instead of that, what you have is a world system which is self-organized. Again, according to Modelsky's theories, order becomes from disorder, or order becomes from chaos, and the self-organization of the basis of the system builds the system. It doesn't mean, because one of the main critics of some of my colleagues, namely, is that those cooperation and self-organization theories do not explain long-term the tendencies of history. Because obviously we historians and the overall public, people need to understand the main lines, the guidelines, the trends, the systems. And so the argument is that if you go to the micro, if you go to this self-organized, you cannot explain the systems. And what we are saying here is that yes, we can. Except we don't explain the systems according to a kind of hierarchical order or a central order that goes to the peripheries. We explain the system building from below, building from the basis, focusing on individuals and not on the institutional frameworks and systems. It is clear what I'm trying to say. There is not a system. There is a system which is complex, which is very dynamic, which is frequently contradictory, which frequently is anti-national in the system, that there are agents of an empire that are collaborating totally with the rivals of other empire. There are individuals that are Portuguese, they are cooperating with the local leaders, and vice versa. So this is quite complex to understand in terms of simple, regulated, binomic worlds. But it brings us the understanding of phenomena that we don't have if we don't go to these complex systems of understanding and going from the study of the history from below, from the basis, from the agents. It is much more complex. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because one thing is that you choose a person, you make a biography, and you say, okay, here we have self-organization, and here we have cooperation. Okay, but one biography does not establish a trend. So in order to deal with all this, you really have to have teams. Individual work is extremely difficult to go with. And the team that I worked with in this DynCoopNet, we worked with 12,000 letters of exchange and 6,000 letters, correspondence letters between merchants, and we worked with a team of 8 people for 4 years. So we worked with the constitution of a database, and that was about more than 60,000 registers on that database, and then we proceed with the network analysis in order to understand the mechanisms of that cooperation. What I mean is that this work is not simple for historians, and is sometimes almost impossible if you work individually, because obviously you cannot work with 1 or 10 agents. You have really to multiply it in a way, and sampling in a way, choosing different cases in a way that the results at the end are representative, are pertinent, and are scientifically sound. So this is quite difficult indeed. We have been trying to do that based on the Portuguese case. And in fact, in the Portuguese case, more and more, you have seen this map that I put here forward, trying to say that the understanding from the Portuguese side of the mechanisms of the expansion is here and not here. Understand? Is really to understand the individual dynamics of the several Portuguese seaports, rather than trying to understand the centrality of Lisbon. So the Portuguese case really suggests that the sustainability of empires, in this case the Portuguese overseas empire, was based on individual agents and their entrepreneurial initiatives as much as in political, economic, military, institutional frameworks. What it suggests is that mechanisms of cooperation are operational at a global level, overtaking political and religious frontiers. It suggests that cooperation between informal and self-organized networks explain globalization patterns and models, which could not be totally explained by state leadership and competition patterns. When you think of globalization only in terms of global economy, for instance, what you see is that the states, the monopolistic states or the monopolistic companies, they brought all those products all over the world. First of all, globalization is not only economic globalization. Secondly, as important as the monopoly of spices by the Portuguese crown or the monopolistic trade of the VOC, the Dutch company, is really this circulation of products, of ideas, of knowledge, of techniques that were brought up by these complex networks of individuals. And we should center the research not only on the macro structural frames, not only on formal, institutional, and central power strategies and dynamics, but on the agents and their interactions, creating, after all, networks that overtake boundaries of historical studies and contributing to a better understanding of globalization. It means that in the next session, so this is the theoretical framework I'm proposing to orient this course. This is the theoretical framework to which I depart from. So the next session, we are going to try to understand how did Portuguese overseas expansion and the subsequent colonization processes contributed to the building of the first global age, who were the agents of such process, and which were the role of the different world spaces. Espaços mundo is a term that is used by Brodel, that is used by Vitorino Magalhães Godinho. It doesn't translate very well the world spaces, but it gives us the idea. It is in the world different geoeconomic spaces that have to be understood, and which are the role of those different space worlds to understand this globalization that I present as being paramount on this called First Global Age. Thank you. So, that said, I think we can go to